Returning to Geopolitics and Empire is Harley Schlanger of the LaRouche Organization and Schiller Institute. Welcome back to Geopolitics and Empire, Harley.
Glad to be with you.
It's been, I think, 3 years since we last spoke. I hope all is well. How are things out where you're at?
Well, other than the fact that we may be drifting into a nuclear war, and Germany is trying to prepare to become war ready, other than that, we're okay.
Well, yeah, things are just peachy otherwise. But before getting to that, though, I wanted to give a shout out to the spooks listening to the podcast, and specifically has to do with you and me. You know, I talk to people from all walks. I'm just an average American, European, Croatian, and now Mexican. I was a professor, and I just, that's what you do when you study international relations. You want to talk to everybody across the spectrum. And so I've talked to conservatives, to libertarians, to leftists, to LaRouche people. And just recently, I believe the spook state, the security state, has been getting involved in alternative media. And they've been doing write-ups on people like myself, on other podcasters, on folks such as yourself. So just for the fact I'm having a conversation with you today, Harley, they're going to say I'm a Russian agent. And I just want to let them know that we can see you coming from a mile away, that this is the spook state pretending to be anonymous X accounts and websites. It's really clear what you're doing, but any comment on that?
Well, if you're outside of the mainstream bubble, you're immediately suspect. And whether it's left or right, they'll call it, LaRouche for many years was called left wing, then right wing. Even though I'm Jewish, I'm called an anti-Semite. The Ukrainian Committee to Combat Disinformation said that I'm on their list of information terrorists and Putin mouthpieces. And one of their articles said that if I'm not getting money from Russia, I'm missing an opportunity. So, and by the way, the CCD of Ukraine is actually coordinated with MI6 and NATO, as they acknowledge in their own bookkeeping. They get funded by the United Kingdom, Commonwealth, and Foreign Office. So there's a method to their madness. They're trying to discredit anybody who breaks with the mainstream. So I take it as a badge of honor, although I do tell you, sometimes I look over my shoulder when I'm walking down the street.
Yeah, and what they're doing is a form of thought police. And again, if you study them, They don't offer any perspective. They have a singular objective, which is to police my thought or your thoughts. And just they're obsessed with Russia and China. They never speak of the corrupt oligarchic globalism in the West, which is another sign, kind of, they never speak ill of NATO or Washington or London or Brussels. And so it's a clear, tell of who they are and what their purpose is. But getting back to
on that point, you look at how they're covering the Syria situation, where they're essentially saying someone who until a month ago was known as a former Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra head chopper is now considered the moderate rebel, the democratic moderate jihadist. So they'll change their narrative as they see fit, because it's not truthful to start with. And arguing with them makes no sense, because they don't recognize the truth when it hits them in the face. But we have to stay consistent and assume that the people who listen and watch your podcast, for example, are going with the ideas that you're presenting, not what they're being told by some outside third party. So hopefully we're reaching people who can think. And when you get attacked by these guys, it actually just is a sign of your effectiveness.
And one thing they don't change, though, are the outfits. There have been memes made of Zelensky and the new guy in charge of Syria. They have the same green outfit and beard. And so,
haircut.
And so you commented to me on how the hardcore imperialists are defending the unipolar order, and then finding their geopolitical axioms endangered by the emergence of the global South, BRICS. And now we have what's happening in Syria, which I see as a huge deal. Erdogan and Turkey is pushing for greater Turkey. Israel is pushing for greater Israel. London, Washington, they've got interests. It wasn't surprising that Assad fell, but it's still shocking. I thought he would have held on longer. I thought there are, even people in the multipolar camp are saying that Russia and Iran sort of dropped the ball here. Your thoughts as to what's happening in Syria and where we're at?
Well, there are a couple of people I listen to on this. One is Chaz Freeman, the former diplomat, former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, who has very good contacts in the Middle East, and also Jacques Beau from Swiss intelligence, another guy he's retired now, but very plugged in. And what both of them said is that there were these meetings in Doha recently in which it became clear to people that as this so-called insurgency developed in Idlib province and then spread to Aleppo, that it had the full support of Erdogan from Turkey. It was also backed by US and NATO, the presence even of Ukrainians there. And then, of course, Israel played its part with the destruction of Hezbollah and the constant bombing of Syria. And what Freeman said is that it may very well be that looking at this picture, as well as the terrible conditions of the Syrian people because of the Caesar sanctions, and no one should forget for a moment the effect of these sanctions in lowering the standard of living, including demoralizing the soldiers because their families can't survive. You put all that together, and Freeman said it may be that Assad decided to avoid bloodshed and avoid destruction. He would leave. So I found that an interesting take from him, but not so inconsistent. The media portrays him as a monster, of course. But in fact, Syria was one of the more progressive places in the whole region until this operation was launched in 2011 for regime change. So I think most of what's said in the media is bunk, unreliable, unless it points out that the attempted regime change has had support from the United States for years, including the United States arming and training elements of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So, it's not a surprise ultimately that a country under attack like that, with so many different fingers in the pot, including Israel and Turkey, that Assad made a decision that he couldn't survive, and it would be better for the people of Syria and for himself and his family to get out of there. Now, the question of what's going to happen in the future, that's really the big issue now. And you have Israel yesterday, almost 400 bombing raids targeting Syrian military installations, destroying the Syrian Navy in one afternoon. Netanyahu saying, "Oh, this is only temporary. Our troops are inside Syria, only temporary." Well, we'll see. But who's going to step forward to stop him? So it's on the whole, it's a mess. And I think the other thing that's interesting is that none of the Arab countries stepped forward to say anything. And they had a rapprochement with Assad over the recent period. But at this point, they backed off and basically said, it's not our fight. And the other loser in this is the Palestinians. The destruction of the leadership of Hezbollah, knocking Syria out of the picture. Lebanon is a mess. And there's no one stepping forward to protect the poor Palestinian people.
So it appears Israel gets a chunk of land or territory, as does Turkey. America, I guess, is in the northeast where the bulk of the oil resources are. In Syria, there's talk of this being a moment for, the 40 million Kurds, Kurdistan, to try to work towards an independent state. Up until I've had a number of guests over the years on, like Morris Berman and Johan Galtung, talk about the decline of American empire. But what just happened to me, I was citing another geopolitical analyst, fellow Croat Nicolo Soldo, who gave a great speech recently saying that the American empire still seems to be going strong. So your thoughts on that, and the specter of war, which you often talk about, a nuclear war. Where do we go from here? Are they pivoting away from Europe towards the Middle East and China? Do they have other surprises waiting for us on the road ahead? Just your thoughts on the aspect of World War III.
Well, that's interesting because just yesterday, the latest issue of Newsweek came out with a headline story, "What would World War III look like?" And they have two leading officials. One is a former Undersecretary of State. And they're basically saying we could easily have a tactical nuclear exchange. The question is who would win. And for us to make sure we win, we have to make sure we protect and preserve some of our nuclear weapons. Now, this follows an extraordinary speech by Admiral Thomas Buchanan on November 20th. He's the policy director of STRATCOM, the Strategic Command in charge of nuclear forces. And he raised the question, what should a nuclear strike from the United States be? And he said, we have to be prepared for this so that we can succeed and have enough weapons left over to maintain our international leadership. Now, it's ironic that here you have top people, including in his case, someone who's active duty military, talking about nuclear war. Well, when you read the media, what they keep saying is Putin is bluffing, Putin is threatening, the Russians are waving their nuclear weapons. And now you have Americans doing that, and there's not a peep out of them. Now, I think what's going on here is that the American empire is significantly weakening. And you see it in terms of the United Nations, the unwillingness of countries to step forward and defend Israel at the U.S. command. The U.S. is still vetoing UN Security Council resolutions, but the rest of the world is not. The rest of the world is moving into a hopefully new era, whether you want to call it multipolar, or I think as Putin called it recently, polyphonic, the idea of many voices in a harmony across the world. As opposed to the idea of multipolar, you still have the conception of two poles that are potentially clashing. And I'm sure that's the way Washington and London see it. So in terms of the overall outlook, the US planners are talking about, can they do a two-front war, Russia and China? And that's really the planning right now. And can they get Netanyahu to knock out Iran? Now, of course, there's a consequence there, which is that Netanyahu is expecting the U.S. to come in and knock out Iran. And this is something from the old Brzezinski-Kissinger period called the breakaway ally scenario, which is that Israel provokes the war, but then when Iran responds in full, America comes in and bails them out. And that's one of the dangers that we have right now, because the United States cannot fight against Iran, Russia, and China. And the idea that we're prepared for a nuclear war is completely insane. The idea that Putin wants a nuclear war is crazy. Putin's been clear on this, what he intends to do, the limited aims of the special military operation. And so I think the problem is that we're not getting the picture in the West. What's coming across is a very single-minded argument, which still says that Ukraine can win the war, that Ukraine was justified, that it's justified to provide these weapons to Ukraine, that Putin is the aggressor, Putin is the problem, Putin's going to come and overrun Europe if we don't stop him. It's the old domino theory from Vietnam War. So the problem is that there's very little clarity for the average person to figure out what's going on. And what we try to do is to give people a bigger picture so they have a sense of what's going on. Just as an example of that, I was on a television interview in Pakistan, and I was asked, what's going on with the Pakistani Taliban attacking the border area between Pakistan and Afghanistan? Who's funding that? Who's behind that? And I said, look, these local issues are important, but the bigger picture is that there is a new great game underway. And that's the fight of Eurasia versus the West. And that's how Putin sees it, as we've seen from some speeches of his recently. Biden, Blinken, they won't articulate it that way, but that's essentially what the British are talking about, that Eurasia is the issue right now. And so what we see at the Schiller Institute is that the big fight is, will there be a move against China and Russia, minimally to try and break them apart? And that's the old Kissinger strategy. How do you keep Russia and China apart? And what they're finding is that the alliance between them is being driven by the war hawks in the West, just as the collapse of the Western economy is not caused by Putin, it's caused by the sanctions policy and the economic policies from the West.
And just to extend on that note for a second, you mentioned Pakistan, and I noted about a week or two ago, Memory is this account online. I think it's a Western security state account. Nonetheless, it's very useful because it publishes primary source material from the East, and there was some guy out of Pakistan or Baluch, out of pushing Baluchistan, because you just mentioned what's going on there, and I think it's Western funded destabilization in that region. For the longest time, they've been trying to break off a chunk of Pakistan, Baluchistan. And it's interesting what this guy mentioned. He said, so he was promoting a free Baluchistan, and he mentioned we need a NATO pact. And it's like, come on. It's obviously this guy's being funded by some, American NGO and National Endowment for Democracy or whatever, and they want to break apart Baluchistan. But just what's transpired in the past couple of weeks, just your quick thought on, you've got that destabilization in Pakistan, NATO pushing breakup of that, the martial law in South Korea, there's something going on in South Korea, the Romanian elections didn't turn out the way Brussels and NATO wanted, so they're redoing democracy, Georgian Rose Revolution 2.0. I can't even keep track of all of these things that are going on. So for me, this is like another sign, rumblings that something big is going on, and that the empire is trying to tie up loose ends, so to speak. Just your thought on this trend.
Well, part of what's big is that nobody knows exactly what Donald Trump coming back into the White House means. Is Trump serious about going after what he calls the deep state or the swamp? And the appointment of someone like Tulsi Gabbard, the appointment at the FBI of the protege of Devin Nunes, the former congressman who was really up front in fighting Russiagate, but Kash Patel, who's the FBI choice of Trump, and like Matt Gaetz also. Now, Gaetz is out, but the appointment of Gaetz initially showed that Trump was serious about going after the networks in the Justice Department, and probably as well the intelligence community that were behind Russiagate. Now, what was Russiagate about? It was an attempt to pit, it was aimed at Putin, but also aimed at Trump to try and contain him. And when you look at the end result of this, you see that virtually everything that was said in Russiagate has been refuted as a British intelligence, Obama intelligence community fraud. So why did they do that? Well, because the biggest problem is that Russia has shown an ability to not only recover its economic development, but to advance in spite of sanctions, in spite of everything being thrown at them. Moreover, Russia is standing as a proof of the commitment to economic sovereignty and to traditional values. And that's the leading issue now emerging in the global South. Will nations have a sovereign right for development, for the use of their own natural resources, or will they continue to be the victims of the predatory neo-colonial policy of the last 40 years? And so there's a global uprising against the establishment, the neoliberal, neocon establishment. That's what the election was in the United States, against the so-called elitism of the Democratic Party, which proved to be totally tone deaf. Families that can't make ends meet because of inflation, they can't cover food, housing, transportation, school costs. And so when they protest that, they're called right-wing extremists. So what we're seeing is a shift in global politics. You mentioned a few of these cases. The South Korea one is very interesting because also, don't forget, in October, Kishida was booted in Japan. So you had the South Korea and Japan, the two countries in Asia that are most supportive of the idea of the Quad, of a global NATO or an Asian NATO. They're in very unstable circumstances. I read today that they're going to go again for the impeachment of Yoon, the president of South Korea. Then you mentioned Romania. Well, what does it mean that you have a potentially pro-Russian president getting elected in Romania? Well, what happened was the European Union went nuts and said, that's not democracy. And here's where you see the narrative falling apart. The narrative of the West comes from the Atlantic Council in particular, which has this authoritarian versus democracy. And of course, if you vote the wrong way, you're authoritarian. And even if it's a democratic vote, they won't accept it. So in Romania, the fact that a moderate nationalist, anti-NATO person came in first in the first round, they annulled the election. They got the Supreme Court in Romania to say it's not good. The same thing happened, I don't know if you remember this, when Orban won the last election. Ursula von der Leyen of the European Union and others, Barroso, the foreign policy head, were saying Hungary's not democratic, it's a pawn of Russia. And after the election, when Orban had over 60% of the vote, they said, well, that's not democracy. That was rigged. They won't accept those kinds of circumstances. So I think what we're seeing is a rebellion internationally against the establishment, because the establishment has had a terrible record between inflation, wars, disruption of community standards overall, censorship. There are a lot of reasons that people are angry. And we're seeing a shift in these perceptions with the former progressives of the left now becoming defenders of censorship, the FBI, the CIA, coups. And we're seeing Republicans who say they're sympathetic to Russia, sympathetic to the whole idea of moving away from the American exceptionalism. I mean, it's a very mixed up situation, as I'm sure you are well aware. But at its heart, it's the collapse of the empire that's been there since the end of World War II, increasingly under American domination as we got into the 60s after the Kennedy assassination. And it's still a very big role for the British, even though they're a very weak country right now, but they're helping to shape the narrative. And then what else is happening? The German government collapsed and the French government collapsed. These are the two centers of power for the European Union. And I just had a chance to attend a meeting in the last couple of days of the Alternative for Deutschland, the so-called right-wing extremist party. And what are they talking about? Peace, ending the green policy, and stopping the censorship. So you would have thought you were at a Linkspartei, a left party meeting when you heard them speak. And then what do you get from Scholz? Well, we've got to win the war in Ukraine, but we're not going to give them the Taurus missiles. But Scholz is planning on accepting intermediate range missiles from the United States in 2026. And so with the election coming up, you have the German election. If I can take a minute to go into this, because I think your viewers will find this fascinating. you have a vote coming up this next week of no confidence in the Schultz government. And there was a possibility that certain parties were going to vote against the no confidence vote to keep Schultz in office because they don't want an election. But it looks as though an election, the no confidence vote will pass, so there'll be an election in February instead of in September. Now, the person who's ahead in the polls, Friedrich Merz of the Christian Democrats, he's the former head of BlackRock in Europe. So he's not too popular. He's only at about 30%. Schultz was down at about 14, 15%. He jumped up a little bit because he made a big show of opposing the deployment of the Taurus missiles, letting the German long-range missiles be used by Ukraine. But then you have the so-called right extremists, the AfD, the second most popular party in the polls. And the third is a totally new party, Sarah Wagenknecht, who came out of the Linkspartei, out of the left. And what's interesting is the left party and the right party are the parties of peace, of anti-NATO, anti-European integration, and opposed to the Green policy. And who is the leading war party? The Greens, which came into existence against the deployment of nuclear weapons in Europe. So it's such a jumble. And if you don't step back and understand that what we're really looking at is an attempt of an empire that's creaky and collapsing to try to reconfigure itself to maintain its control as a unipolar order. And that's what's threatened by Russia, by China, by India, South Africa, Brazil, the emergence of the global South, even smaller countries like Malawi and Niger and Burkina Faso, the three French West African colonies that have now kicked the French out completely, including the French currency system that they had. And they're saying, we want to have our raw materials used for our own people. And so we're seeing a rebellion against neocolonialism. So it's a fascinating situation. It's hard to stay on top of it because it's moving so quickly.
You mentioned Atlantic Council. Just wanted to go back to that. I mean, they portend to espouse these democratic values and liberty. Meanwhile, they are so Orwellian, so totalitarian. The Atlantic Council is part of that infrastructure of this information warfare, which has been against me. When I interviewed folks like Francis Boyle in 2020, a year later, Associated Press put out a hit piece that was co-written by Atlantic Council. And then that same week, I was taken off of Patreon. And then a year later, by the Department of Homeland Security, which, I'm just an American just talking. And so they're trying to police thought, which is totalitarian. And what you mentioned with the referendums, I remember in the 2000s with Ireland and my other country of Croatia, which became an EU member in 2013. In the 2000s, Brussels would, EU, NATO, I put them, this all one blob, they would run these referendums for accession to the EU. And, in Ireland was the same case as in Croatia. This is relevant to the example of the elections in Romania. People would say, no, we don't want EU. I first heard many years ago fellow Croats referring to the EU as Euroslavia. We just came out of communist totalitarian Yugoslavia. We became a republic for 20 years, and now we're back into Euroslavia. Soviet dissidents call it the new European Soviet. There's evidence that it has Brussels has Nazi roots, so it's like a form of a Fourth Reich. But my point is that they'd run these referendums. People say, no, we don't want to join the EU. And then the EU would come back, manipulate, Atlantic Council, manipulate public opinion, controlling the mass media in these countries, do another referendum where they get a higher percentage, and then another one until finally they got enough popular opinion to push the country into the EU. So it's the same thing as I think playing out in Romania. I did want to, you brought up Trump. Yesterday, I saw a note by retired Indian diplomat Badra Kumar. He pointed out that according to the U.S. Department of State, no foreign leaders were ever present at this swearing-in ceremony since 1874. that because Trump just invited Xi Jinping. This is
Yeah.
he says this is a profound move by Trump, as invite to Xi Jinping was extended no sooner than his victory on November 5th, hugely consequential to world politics. Meanwhile, we have the tech war, the economic war between China and USA with chips and semiconductor stuff, and Trump talking things up with regarding tariffs with Canada and USA and China. Yet he's inviting Xi Jinping. One thing in Trump's last term, you have to hand it to him. He was willing to meet with Kim Jong-un and everyone, which I think is I studied diplomacy. This is what a diplomat is supposed to do. You're supposed to meet with the best of the best and the worst of the worst, and just dialogue, which is what NATO doesn't want us to do. Atlantic Council and their spooks in the alternative media do not want dialogue. We need dialogue, and so just your thoughts on that.
Well, if people know where the Atlantic Council comes from, initially the British move into American policy was after Versailles, after the end of World War I, where the Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, met with American lawyers and Wall Street people who were part of the US delegation. And they said, you need a think tank like ours, and basically convinced them that they need an intelligence service. But at the time, it wasn't such a acceptable idea. Gentlemen don't read other gentlemen's mail, was the comments that people were making. But gradually what happened is you had a grouping in the United States, the early globalists that included the Harriman family, the Bush family. Prescott Bush was a partner with Roland Harriman in the Brown Brothers Harriman Bank. They were part of the formation of the trusts that were essentially global corporations. And the policy that grew out of this, that was defended by the intelligence services in Britain. And this is why I bring up the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States. These were institutions that opposed or supported globalization, what we call today globalization. But they didn't mean a total free market. They meant the ability of monopolies to squeeze everybody out from the top internationally. And so it was the formation of these cartels that was at the core of the British support for the Nazis, to bring in Hitler with the idea that this can be used to crush the unions and crush socialism in Germany, and then move against the Soviet Union. So you had this strange conflation of interests, and it became somewhat stale after World War II. And so the Atlantic Council was created at the end of the 50s, again, as an American institution, but largely British, and trying to keep the United States in politics in Europe. And this brings us to the whole question of Trump and NATO. What is Trump going to do? Now, I've had a chance to do some work in the US archives and look at the whole debate of the expansion of NATO. And it's absolutely clear that the US promised there'd be no expansion of NATO. They didn't sign anything on it, but they said it repeatedly. I had a chance to talk with Horst Teltschek, who was the chief advisor to Helmut Kohl, the German chancellor. And he said, of course, they told us that. They told us there'd be no expansion of NATO eastward. Well, NATO kept expanding eastward. And the question for people like, even someone like George Kennan, who was involved in establishing the principle of containment after World War II, what Kennan said is that if you go ahead with expanding NATO, it's going to be a threat to the Russians, not just the Soviets. After the Soviet Union was gone, the Russians will feel threatened. This is what William Burns, who's now the CIA director, he wrote a memo from the Moscow embassy saying "yet" means "yet." They do not want an expansion of NATO eastward. So this has been a big issue for a long time. Now, the Atlantic Council is the leading voice now. Frederick Kemp, the CEO, the leading voice in favor of NATO expansion. And the example they use is if it weren't for NATO, Ukraine would have been gobbled up, and probably Poland and the Baltic states also. And so what they play on is the idea that Europe will be united and backed fully by this alliance of so-called democratic, freedom-loving countries, when in fact they're protecting the corporate cartels and the global system, which is collapsing. And there's a reason for that, and it gets back to economics. What's happening is that the debt is growing exponentially, and it can't be covered when you deindustrialize. There's not enough new wealth being produced. So they're trying to accelerate the looting process of the poorer countries, who are now saying, no, you're not doing that anymore. So where do they go for the loot? They go to the US population. They go to the European population. They have austerity. They create inflation. They bail out the bankrupt firms. And so we see that the empire is tottering. It can't continue to exponentially extend the debt. And the problem here is, why are they going into debt? Because the corporations are not making enough money. And so, they say, well, we're liquid. Well, that's because the Federal Reserve System pumps money in. But there's a difference between solvency and liquidity. And they're insolvent. They're not producing enough. So the debt keeps growing. The inflation is a product of that. And organizations like the Atlantic Council come in to say, we have to have an alliance for freedom against the authoritarians, when in fact the authoritarians are the International Monetary Fund, the ones who are imposing the austerity, and the ones who are proposing cuts in living standards or cuts in government in order to reduce the debt. But the problem is, if you shrink the economic pie, you're not going to resolve the debt problem. You're going to have to continue to borrow more to just maintain operations. So their whole system is breaking down now. And under Biden, this accelerated. Now, it's not clear what Trump is going to do to address this. A big tax cut is not going to solve the problem. Tariffs won't solve the problem. There are certain things he's talking about which would work as a way of reindustrializing, but he doesn't have the monetary components to do that. So here's where you look then at the real divide in the world, the BRICS, the emergence of a potential new development system, which we're told in the United States, we're told the BRICS is out to get the dollar. Well, no, the dollar's been destroying them. It's the dollar that was weaponized against them. They're now saying we have to take measures to protect ourselves from this weaponization of the dollar, the sanctions policy, and so on. And they're doing things such as using their own currencies for settlement in trade. There's a lot going on with that. But what Putin said is, we don't want to exclude you. We want you to be part of this new system. All we're saying is that we have to protect ourselves, and that's why we're de-dollarizing. But Putin is realistic enough to know that Russia at this point couldn't survive if you completely remove the dollar system. So they're moving in a very systematic way to create an alternative system. But they're not there yet. And they're very vulnerable to US manipulations and City of London manipulations. And that's where something like the Atlantic Council comes in. What do they say is the issue? Putin is a Russian imperialist who wants to conquer Europe, wants to reconstitute the Soviet Empire. That's not what Putin is trying to do. Even if you oppose the idea of Russian invasion of Ukraine, you have to realize that if they really wanted to destroy Ukraine, they could have done it. And that's not what they're trying to do. So the clarity is not there for anybody. And that's our job. My organization takes upon ourselves the responsibility to have dialogue, to have discussions, bring different people into our conferences. We just had a very extraordinary conference, which included a number, Dmitry Krenin, a top official from the former Carnegie Institute in Moscow. Now he's basically an advisor to the foreign ministry. Zhang Weiwei, a leading Chinese scholar. Naledi Pandor, the former foreign minister of South Africa, spoke there. We had just an extraordinary lineup of speakers who are excited to have a dialogue, an open discussion, which is not controlled the way the Atlantic Council and the CFR and these other institutions control the dialogue. So I think discussion is the way out. And the BRICS are moving in a very systematic way to create not necessarily a new financial system, but at least in the short term, a protection for countries that are very vulnerable. And of course, as you know, where do these wars come from? In the past, when leaders of poorer countries stood up and said, we're not going along with this anymore, that's when Gaddafi signed his death warrant, Saddam signed his death warrant. Now, because of the Russia-China alliance, they're feeling stronger that these poorer countries can stand up. And the Chinese are helping, the Russians are helping. And so we have a potential for a whole new paradigm developing. And I think that's the hope for humanity now, in what otherwise looks like a fairly bleak landscape.
I would just add that I do view, I think a year or two ago, someone whom I very much dislike, Guy Verhofstadt of the EU, came out and said that we live in an age of empires. And I think he had a point. I do view Russia as a form of empire, as I do China. But what Wolfgang Streeck, I think he's a German intellectual, said, he says that the EU is an empire. And of course, we know we have the American empire. And so I would just put that on the board. But I would say that Russia is large enough. It's not as expansionist as the EU, NATO empire, which is expanding like crazy. You had just this year retired Admiral Stavridis in Bloomberg say, let's just I like to joke, cut the foreplay. He literally said, let's just take Singapore and Thailand and make them members of NATO. I mean, total insane expansion. And the worst thing is it's total Orwellian, again, double speak. Hey, we're a democracy, we're not an empire, but they're expanding like crazy while Russia isn't, and neither are China, or at least not. This is like what the West is doing is like 1,000% of what Russia or China are doing. So what really gets me is that obscene hypocrisy and double standards. You mentioned BRICS, just for a second, just getting for your further thought on how that's advancing. I read an article just yesterday from about a month or a month and a half ago saying that in the major setback to China's Belt and Road, Brazil has decided against joining Beijing's multi-billion-dollar initiative, becoming the second country after India not to endorse the mega project. Lula didn't make it to the Kazan meeting, supposedly because he had health issues. I think I read this week he
just had some surgery.
Right. And so there's been criticisms. There's been a lot of talk in the BRICS world of many things, of hype, of BRICS payment systems and other things. We all know that it is a global tectonic transition like this takes years, decades. Just your thoughts on the hype versus the reality, and how do you sort of see BRICS and Belt and Road developing forward?
Well, defenders of the empire are saying two different things. On the one hand, they're saying China's economy is crashing, Russia's economy is going to crash, and that as this happens, the BRICS will fall apart. Then on the other hand, they say the BRICS are about to take over the world. Russia's about to take over the world. So you realize that they're making up stories, narratives, because they're not quite sure what's going on or what to do. Now, we have, in the past, have had a close relationship with one of the more serious economists in Russia, Sergei Glaziev. And Glaziev said LaRouche was the greatest economic thinker of the last century. And what he's been talking about is the question of physical economy as opposed to monetarism. The difference between monetarism and physical economy. The monetary policy is what I was describing before. When you use bursts of money to cover unpayable debt, the plunge protection team, it's sometimes called in the United States, to push the stock market up. But the reality is that there are trillions, if not quadrillions of dollars tied up in financial instruments of no underlying value. That's what derivatives are. They're derived from something of value, but no value on their own. Yet these are the main source of income for the major banks, the trading of these instruments. Now, how does that produce wealth? Produces money, gets into the hands of the billionaires. But what about the average person? What about the nation? Are we producing what we need to advance this civilization? Are we producing enough to have a future for the children? And the physical economy is contracting in the West. That's what's happening. Look, in Germany, we're about to lose the auto sector. The auto sector, automobile sector, is the driver of the European Union economy. And Volkswagen is either going to shut down or move out of Germany. I mean, it's really quite astonishing how rapidly the German economy is going down, including the electricity prices are going way up. So companies can't afford to operate here. The borrowing costs are still very high in Europe for corporations. So we're seeing an economic collapse unfold. And yet they're looking at China, and what the Chinese are doing is they're letting the air out of the bubble. They're bringing down some of the speculation on rental properties and housing markets and so on. And that's called a slowdown. Well, it is a slowdown, but at the same time, they're continuing to invest in new technologies and new industries. The Belt and Road Initiative has 140 nations involved with it. And so you have some setbacks because Brazil has a problem right now, which is partly inflation, partly other things, and also a kind of crazy government to its south with Malay and Argentina. But I think in the long run, what we're learning is that if nations want to develop, they're going to have to figure out how to have a credit system that puts credit into the areas where they want to develop. They need to advance infrastructure. And the one country that's helping with infrastructure internationally is China. Now, interestingly, Russia is also. Russia's helping with energy infrastructure for many African countries. So, the upside of the BRICS is that they're emphasizing investment in physical goods production, which means that countries that have resources but have been having their resources looted, like Niger, for example. Niger produces 75% of the uranium used to produce electricity in France. But in Niger itself, only about 20% of the population has electricity for the full day. So what if they develop nuclear fission power grids, or some of the new kinds of smaller nuclear technologies? Well, that's what the Chinese and Russians are trying to build for them. So if the credit system comes into existence around physical economic production, and then interconnectivity with high-speed rail and systems like that, then you're talking about a totally new economy that is not based on monetary values or speculation. And that's what's scaring the hell out of Wall Street and the City of London, because their forte is speculation and how to make money on other people's losses. Soros is a typical guy. I mean, I find it kind of strange that Trump has chosen the former head of Soros Fund Management to be his Treasury Secretary. The guy who made his fortune by destroying the pound in 1992 and then the yen in 2013. So, it's an imperfect world. And I don't know if Trump's going to let him do what he wants to do anyway. The one thing I've always said about Trump is the only predictable thing is that he's unpredictable. And he's going to make sure he's controlling as much as possible this time around, rather than farming it out to people like Steve Mnuchin the way he did last time.
It's definitely going to be an interesting 4 years. I do want to bring up, one of the biggest criticisms of I guess myself and some listeners of BRICS and multipolarity. There's a range of questioning, but some question, how does the Western, let's call it Western globalist American empire, have tentacles that reach into Moscow or Beijing and BRICS? And one of the things that people point out is that there's one common denominator. There's different issues, as you say. Well, we just talked about. There's clashes geopolitically and different systems, but a lot of these governments, from Washington to Beijing to Moscow to Brussels, and in many ways, Brussels leads the way on this, is that they all, to different extents, don't mind bringing online technological control measures. A lot of these things that we're seeing, digital IDs, QR codes. And so do you have any thoughts onto the BRICS world's involvement with these types of activities, which are being done in the West?
Well, let's take the most extreme case, which is a lot of the MAGA people say that China has a social credit system. China has central bank digital currency. So you don't have any freedom. Now, what they're missing is that China has lifted 800 million people out of poverty in the last 2 decades. And that China continues to build a middle class. And that in general, people are happy in China. They use the case of the Uyghur separatist movement in Xinjiang province. And yet one of the leading Muslim organizations in the world, the Muslim League, sent in a team to investigate and found out that, in fact, the Muslims in Xinjiang province are happy because they now have businesses, they now have jobs. And before, the reason the Chinese were oppressing them was because they were terrorists. This was a separatist movement there. So, on the one side, they basically say that everything China's doing is toward a dictatorship, and China's moving to take advantage of all the countries around them. China does not have a history of invading other countries. It's not an imperial power. And Xi Jinping's idea is win-win, that if we can help you develop, as they're doing, for example, with Indonesia or Malaysia. Malaysia wanted a high-speed rail system, but one of the problems was they didn't have trains. So the Chinese went in and helped them fund and build one of the most advanced engineering complexes to build modern high-speed rail, high-speed trains. So this idea of win-win is very different than we see for the most part from the West, which is the zero-sum game. We win, you lose. And how do you get governments to accept that? Well, that's what the IMF conditionalities program is. You hold out a carrot to them. You say, we'll make sure you get some credit, but you have to first carry out the austerity. And by the time the austerity is done, there's no way to accept the carrot because they've lost what little margin of profit they were making. So I think a lot of these arguments against the BRICS are using a straw man. First of all, the BRICS do not have a currency yet. There's not a BRICS currency. They're trading, for example, the rupee and the ruble between India and Russia. The Saudis accepting yuan from China to pay for their oil. That's a shift. The petrodollar system is broken now, which is good for mankind. What's going to replace it? Well, we'll see. There's a transitional period. Nobody really knows. What Putin said, which I really thought should be studied at the BRICS summit that just took place, was we're in the middle of an experiment. We're not sure where we're going to end up, but we know one thing. We're not going to go back to where we were. And that's the hope that many of these countries have. that they can play a role in shaping a whole new development architecture. And that's what Russia and China are encouraging. Then you have India. India is one of the more interesting places here because they're growing like crazy. They have a big tech sector. They still have a lot of poverty. But what's interesting about India is that every attempt to turn them against Russia and China has been rejected by the Indians. In fact, the Indians and the Chinese are now finally in negotiations to settle their border disputes. Now, that may take another 10 or 20 years, but in the meantime, they're not shooting at each other. And I think what we can see from the BRICS is this idea that you can negotiate based on mutual benefit. And in that sense, what we like about it is the principle of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 that ended the 30 Years' War, that you don't interfere in another country's affairs, but you wish them well. You recognize that it's in your benefit if they're doing well. So it's sort of like the golden rule among nations, as opposed to who has the gold rules. And so I think this idea of cooperation, mutual benefit, that's what's coming forward with the break from the unipolar order. In the unipolar order, everyone knows that ultimately, as long as you're trading in dollars, every trade you make is going to provide a certain margin of profit to the people who change your dollars, give you the dollars. They're going to make some profit off all of this that comes out of your benefit, as opposed to working out a transfer system or a trade system, which is about the value of the goods exchanged as opposed to how do you make money from another country. And if you make money from another country, it's because you're selling them a good product, not that you have the power to control their trading by who has the currency. So I think it's going to be very uncertain. We're going through a period of transition. But I think what Putin has been saying, and this is maybe why people say I'm a Putin puppet or a Putin mouthpiece, he's saying what's right, which is that we're not going to we're in a moment of great transformation. Lavrov said this to Tucker Carlson. He said the old empire is not going to be there anymore. So the question is, what can we do to shape a world in which there's mutual benefit? And that's discussion, dialogue, and real trade, as opposed to threats that if you don't do what we say, we're going to cut you off. So on the whole, I'm pretty optimistic. But if someone were to say exactly what will the BRICS do, I'd have to say I don't think anybody knows.
I would agree. I think a lot of things are up in the air, and we don't know what the new type of currency will be. A lot of unknowns. And just real quick, you asked me offline about Mexico, where I am. Do you have any thought on Mexico? What's interesting or important for you there regarding developments and USA and all that?
Well, I think it's interesting that AMLO was able to hand over the government to his own choice. I think, the old saying about Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. You have the trade agreement that I think does restrict them a little bit. In fact, I think AMLO said one of the reasons he did not want to go immediately into the BRICS was because of the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. And that's going to be interesting to see what happens there. I think there are some positive signs from Mexico that include the changes that are going on in South America generally. There was just this conference in Peru where Xi Jinping was there, where they're opening this new super port. And the key to it is the idea of the rail connection from the Pacific to the Atlantic. That if you actually have some of these great projects, it will transform the terrain of South America. And Mexico, as much as it suffers from its closeness to the United States, also has a benefit. For example, if the United States undertook a major water project, bringing water from Alaska down to the Arizona desert, that could be extended into Mexico, where you have dry areas that need the water. I know in Mexico you have the Plino and Plagon project. There are a number of these major water projects to help with agriculture. So, Mexico's potentially in a situation for takeoff, but a lot of that's going to depend on what happens in the United States. So it is this, what is it, cerca de los Estados Unidos and lejos de Dios.
Porfirio Diaz, that's right. And
Yeah.
I would wager, the biggest focus, for Mexico should be the security situation, which is we're shooting ourselves in the foot because, I've mentioned before, statistics show, the semi trucks, the trailers that bring all the goods, 50 a day are being hijacked by organized crime. I literally know people left and right who get extorted, who try to open businesses the next day, come the cartels demanding the mafia tax. And you cannot run an economy. And imagine if we didn't have to deal with that, if we could open a business and do business and not worrying about my mail not getting delivered because the mail service, the corrupt workers there take it or whatever, then Mexico could really make an advance forward. Right. So for me, that's the top thing that needs to be dealt with. And then after that, these other things that you're mentioning, development and all so forth. And so we've covered a lot. Harley, any final thought for us?
Well, it may seem as though I'm sort of all over the place because the world is all over the place. It's an extremely fluid situation. And what I would advise people is don't back away from it or don't assume the worst. There are good things happening. We're seeing major changes going on in Africa right now. I think the countries such as Indonesia and Malaysia have found their footing. Vietnam, there's an enormous potential. The problem is that if you see these countries gain as your loss, which is what the zero-sum game of the empire is, then you try to stop it. And that's why you have wars. And so we've got to figure out a way to stop the cartels from insisting that there's only one way to do it, the so-called rules-based order of Tony Blinken, which is, by the way, Blinken is a protege of Madeleine Albright, who is a protege of Brzezinski. So you have the worst of the technotronic world of Brzezinski in this guy Blinken. And, as a result, the United States, and I think he is the one controlling, he and Sullivan are the ones controlling Biden on foreign policy. And they're committed to NATO and the wars. So we'll see what happens with Trump. If Trump really does make an effort to end this Ukraine war and does not go overboard with supporting Israel against the Palestinians, we could see a period of peace break out. Horrors, would say Blinken and Sullivan and their military-industrial complex controllers. Horrors, we don't need peace. We tried it. It didn't work. We couldn't make enough money. Well, I think the world needs peace. And hopefully we're in an era where diplomacy is brought back into the forefront.
I shared an image yesterday, given what you just said, that said, I'm not interested in competing with anyone. I hope we all make it. And I hope we all do make it. All of your links are in the description, your X account. Where are the best places for people to go, any projects or conferences coming up?
Well, we just had an extraordinary conference, which people can view the 4 panels. That's at the schillerinstitute.com, SCHILLER institute.com. And I do a daily video update of 10 to 12 minutes where I pick up on leading developments and try to give a historical perspective so people have a sense of the dynamic. That's available through the LaRouche organization, And when you go on the website, you click on programs, and the first thing that pops up is Harley's Daily Updates. So that's how people can see that. That's where my articles are posted. And if people want to be in touch with me, I encourage that. I give out my personal email, which is harleysch@gmail.com. And, I have a lot of correspondence, and actually it's a good way of getting an intelligence picture of what's going on in the world when you have people who communicate and ask questions and have comments. So I encourage that. If people want to talk to me, feel free to send me an email, and I do respond.
All right. Hopefully it's not 3 years before our next conversation. Thank you for being on Geopolitics.
Hopefully, I don't know how that happened, but let's stay in touch.